A climber's style is the way that they show their strengths through the way that they climb. This could range from using flexibility to cheat a dyno, or being dynamic and relying on contact strength to avoid stemming. Climbing style is an important aspect of any climber, but it's not only climbers who can have style. Mountainside Park is a clear example of this because on almost every problem there's some form of new school bouldering, whether it's the huge dead point on Cafe Bustelo or straight up dynos like on Ollie's Weak Dad. This style of dynamic bouldering is very dependent on the climber's ability to not only throw themselves, but to be able to hit the hold and stick it, while also being able to manage the release of tension. Of course, these types of moves aren't exclusive to new school bouldering, and they look nothing like the volume running seen at world-class comps, but it's the same principles. When these problems are compared to the ones seen at the Sourlands, there's a stark contrast. The problems at the Sourlands tend to have worse holds and much more static moves, and again, it's not so much that being static is always old school and being dynamic is always new school, but the dynamic problems at the Sourlands don't require the same amount of commitment and tension that the ones at Mountainside do. Likewise, the static problems at Mountainside don't require the same amount of finger strength and contact strength. But that's enough about the Sourlands, and maybe I can make another video on it in the future, but for now, let's just talk about Mountainside. A climber can develop their own style based on what they're good at, but a rock can't do that. So isn't it fair to assume that the way the rock forms is what determines the style of climbing? To a certain extent this is true, but I would argue that the person who develops the line is the one who determines the style, especially with larger boulders where a line could exit in multiple directions because the climber that makes the line chose to go a certain way for a reason. For example, if I'm a very static climber who is great at stemming, there is no way I'm going to develop a line that has a hard dyno at the end when I could instead exit another way that plays to my static strength. This is most definitely the case with Mountainside because the guys who develop the area are a bunch of new school style boulderers who love to throw themselves around and play with their tension. A great example of this is Cafe Bustelo, a V7 that has a very hard first move and a tensiony finish dependent on how you approach it. Here we see Chris Lopez, the guy who got the first ascent of the line, and he uses his bump beta. Basically, he hits the far right hand on a good crimp, but has really bad feet, so he gets a heel on the arete to have a compression. He then bumps his right hand to another good crimp with all his body weight pulling him to the left. Of course, this beta works for him, and it's great that he made it work, but to me this looked very inefficient. My thought process was along the lines of, why would I bump if I could match the right hand and get a toe hook to have the exact same compression without having my center of gravity move around so much? In the end, I used a toe hook on the arete and matched on both crimps in order to get my left hand on the arete and my right hand on the higher crimp. Both betas accomplish the exact same thing, which is using the right hand crimp and the arete to compress, but the first ascent beta is much more dynamic and tension heavy, while my beta was much more finger intensive and static. Another thing to note about Cafe Bustelo is how it starts in a very scrunchy position where the climber has to throw their body weight around the arete. This is definitely not the most obvious starting position, but again, it plays to Lopez's tension strength while adding a ton of difficulty to the problem. Cafe Bustelo is a classic, and definitely reflective of the park's style, but it's also a very dynamic problem, so let's take a look at some more static ones. The two clearest examples would be Jake the Dog and the Turkey. The former of the two has a signature move where the climber comes out of a knee bar with a double gas stone and they inch their way up to a decent crimp while trying to keep the tension. If the climber goes too fast, their center of gravity will fall too far away from the wall and they won't be able to stick the crimp. Also, because of the angle of the wall, the climber has to use the knee bar, with their left foot in a very awkward position and their right foot far away as either a drop knee or just pulling really hard. It makes for an interesting move that uses tension like a dead point while remaining static the entire time. I think that Chris Lopez did an amazing job finding this move because it just shows how diverse climbing styles can be when they're pushed to their limits. The Turkey is also a great example because of the way that the bat hang creates tension. It's a bit hard to see in the video, but the gist is that the bat hang isn't pulling the climber in any direction, just down and a tiny bit to where the feet are. So, when the climber bumps their hand, their hips move as if it were a dead point, which it might as well have been, since there are only 2 points of contact at one point in time. It's fairly similar to the move on Jake the Dog, since it's a very tension-heavy problem without a lot of the dynamics that make tension moves hard for static climbers. This move forces the climber to understand how to manage tension through technique rather than just squeezing really hard which is what makes it so unique and stylistic. Overall, the bouldering at Mountainside is very tension dependent and dynamic. That being said, there are tons of new climbers going to check out the park, and hopefully new lines with different styles are put up. In the meantime though, here's a fun moderate I established that uses some good crimps with a few throws into an easy top out.